Hey everybody, welcome back to Nerdy Over 30, the podcast where we talk about movies, games, and everything pop culture. This is a pretty special episode for me. Today we have Dr. Richard Spence. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good, good. I know we usually on here tackle more like pop culture, stuff like that, but I think this kind of fits in, and I will ask you to, give us a little brief synopsis of who you are and what your specialty is.
Okay, well, my name is Rick Spence, Richard Spence. I'm going to be formal about it. Professor Richard Spence, if you really want to be that performer, a doctor professor, if you want to be even more formal than that. I don't place a high value on titles, so you don't have to refer to me as doctor or professor.
Gotcha.
I am just I am a PhD in history from the University of California, Santa Barbara. That's right, surfing branch. And hopefully, I did not surf while I was there. And I taught for some 34 years at the University of Idaho as a professor of history. I retired in 2020, and I'm enjoying being retired because that gives me more time to do things like this and a lot of other things as well. So, as a professional historian, which means supposedly I have some sort of paper credentials for that type of thing, so do a lot of people. One of the things that I was most interested in early on was actually in modern Russian history. That's my sort of main groove in terms of history. Now, when you study modern Russian history, you inevitably study the Russian Revolution. It looms over everything else. And when you study revolutions, you plunge into politics and ideology, but the other thing that you plunge into when you study revolutions is conspiracy, because conspiracy is real, certainly in revolution. You cannot have a successful revolution without a successful conspiracy. It is absolutely necessary to do that, because if you try to overthrow the government without conspiring properly, your head will be on a spike by noon. All right? Governments tend not to like that type of thing, and they will kill you. So, a successful revolution entails some degree of, in generally, successful conspiratorial activity. And when you get into that, you get into the whole mechanism, the methodology, the ideas, the underworld of subterfuge and subversion. And so the study of one revolution necessarily entails another one. So it's really through my interest in Russian history and the Russian Revolution that led me to the realm of political conspiracy, the role played by secret societies in that, and then eventually into the ever widening and fascinating realms of espionage and then occultism, which also connect in a weird way, but maybe we'll get to that.
Yes. So how I discovered you is I was watching some podcast one day. I saw a title about secret societies and occultism, and that caught my attention. And I watched one podcast with you, and then one thing led to another. I watched another one, and I watched another one, and then I started looking up books that you wrote, and I was fascinated because I'm always been fascinated with the occult and secret societies and things of that nature, but I've never found someone who just kind of delves into that as much as you do.
Well, people ask me, how do you get interested in things like that? And, the first thing is that they're interesting. Well, they're either not interesting, if you find that sort of thing interested, you're going to be
Mhm.
attracted to it. So, espionage and occultism to me were much more interesting than, let's say, agricultural statistics and accounting. Okay, that's why I didn't become an accountant or an insurance salesman, where I probably could have made more money. But nevertheless, you do, and then that's one of the things, I would say that one of the real advantages to an academic career, of course, it depends on where you're teaching and exactly what you're doing, but generally speaking, is you really get to pursue things that you're interested in.
Mhm.
You don't have to spend your time doing a job that consists of things that either you actively dislike or that bore you, just in order to get the money to do what you want to do. That doesn't say you get to do, you have to sometimes teach survey courses that don't interest you, but nevertheless, that's one of the actual advantages to it. And the other thing about it is that one thing leads you to another. It's like I was just saying, is that from an interest in Russian history leads you to the Russian Revolution, leads you to the role of conspiracy, and then you begin to find out all these other things that come into it as well. So it's always expanding, and you also you find things that you can't explain. So one of the things that apparently I like, so it took a friend of mine to explain this to me because, sometimes other people can see things in you that you're oblivious to, which are obvious to everyone else, is that I really like mysteries or puzzles. I like some sort of thing of trying to figure out what's going on. And so I've spent much of my career doing that. The people that I've written biographies on are all to one degree or another mysteries. Um, you never, it's the same way you can say that you never know a person completely. And when you're trying to know or understand a person remotely, that is people that like your wife, girlfriend, family members, there's always some level of people that you never quite get. There's always an aspect to them that you never see. In the same way that there's a part of you that no one else sees either. There's the you that only you know, probably for a good reason. So if there's problem understanding other people that you meet with and interact every day, that's only compounded when you're trying to reconstruct the ideas and the mindset, when you're trying to get inside the head of a person who's been dead for 100 years. And a person who you find out is essentially a pathological liar, or that you can't trust anything that they say. They consistently lie about things, and which other people that they encounter mostly dislike them. So if you're trying to reconstruct the life or the attitude or the mentality of someone who is a consistent liar and was largely hated by most of the people they encountered, it's difficult and you'll never get it entirely. But that's okay. See, the thing is, at a certain point, I'm okay with that. I would like to know the answers, but I've reconciled myself to knowing, or at least to realizing, that in many cases I'll never know it entirely. But that's also what keeps it interesting, because there's nothing more boring than a mystery that you've solved. The mystery is gone. And more often than not, I mean, sometimes it's like, oh, well, that's really neat, and I've discovered something fantastic. But more often than not, you solve the mystery, and it's kind of disappointing.
Like most are, yes.
Yeah, it's just, oh, well, that's what it was. Okay. Um, so you don't always want to know the answers to things. So that's one of the things I would suggest to people, explore your interests and delve into those mysteries, but don't expect that you're ever going to figure it out entirely. And it might be better that you don't, because then the possibility of all those things exist. Whereas when it all collapses down like a dying star into one possibility, it's usually not going to be that interesting.
No, it's almost like collecting. Once you find the thing that you're trying to collect, and then you just get it, put it on the shelf, go on to the next thing, that whole excitement's gone.
Yeah, where you're trying to collect a set of everything and you get them all.
Mhm.
Well, now you've got them all. There are no more than you can ever get. And, you'll lose interest quickly.
So, talking about people that you've done extensive research on, I am ever so fascinated with Mr. Aleister Crowley,
Uh,
who is a very, I guess, misunderstood person. Uh, how about you give us your thoughts on Mr. Crowley?
well, probably, I mean, somewhere along the line, it's not like I'm the only Aleister Crowley guy. No, there's a lot of those, but
Oh no,
I
of course.
became an Aleister Crowley guy.
Hmm.
And that's, shameless plug here. I wrote a book called Secret Agent 666, Aleister Crowley, British Intelligence and the Occult. And that was all based upon an earlier article I'd written. So one of the things you do, especially in academia, is, is there a book in this? I don't know. Maybe there's an article, which is something shorter, and you can see whether or not there's actually anything to it. And you don't have to invest a lot of time. You don't want to spend a lot of time researching writing a book to figure out that there's nothing there. So one of the questions about Aleister Crowley, who is a, lots of people know his name. There are many people who still practice his beliefs or think they do. I think I've probably encountered more that sort of think they do than actually do in this case. And he's still regarded. This was a guy who, in his lifetime, was called things like the wickedest man in the world, the man we'd like to hang, an arch traitor, and is often viewed still today as probably one of the arch Satanists of the 20th century. And that, at least, that last part of that is probably unjust because at no point in time did Crowley ever describe himself as a Satanist.
Mhm.
Now, there were people that argue that, well, real Satanists never would. Actually, they do a lot. Okay. Anton LaVey did, the guy who
Yep.
founded the Church of Satan in San Francisco in 66. And Anton LaVey was a complete fake.
Oh,
That
yeah.
is, he's
Fake.
he was a pretend Satanist. Now, I think he would, I don't think he would object to that characterization. It was a permanent Halloween party in his case. So Crowley was, which isn't to say that Crowley was really a kind or a generous or hospitable person. He was a very difficult person, as far as I'm able to tell. Um, a tough friend to have. um, Probably, there was one person who knew him who said, I think from a position of actually knowing the man, that the two things I would never do is lend Aleister Crowley money or leave him alone with my children. And that would probably be a good idea, probably because he would scare them more than anything else. So I think there are lots of things that are attributed to him. The legend that was created, the wickedest man in the world thing, was an image that he liked at a certain point in his life. Because one of he was, it's what we call an iconoclast. That was he liked pissing people off,
Mm.
especially sort of proper society. And he would deliberately do and say and act in ways that would offend the sort of prevailing morals. And to a certain degree, and you would get an argument about this, that was a kind of role which he played. So here's a little detail which I think is often missed, and I don't think it's an unimportant detail. Aleister Crowley really wasn't Aleister Crowley, at least in terms of legal identity. He was born Edward Alexander Crowley Jr. He's named after his father. His father, by the way, was a Christian fundamentalist minister. That's an interesting thing about Crowley, is that he grew up in what we would now describe as a Christian fundamentalist household. Both of his parents were part of that. And his father died when he was quite young, and he always seems to have had very fond feelings towards his father. Not so much his mother, who lived on for a much longer time. I think they had a more complicated relationship in that way. And in a way, Aleister Crowley sort of followed in his father's footsteps, although early on, he sort of, Alistair was his stylized version of his middle name. And part of that, I think, was just to kind of establish a separate identity for himself. Some people don't like being Eddie Jr., and so he became Alistair. But he never did that legally, as far as I can tell. I mean, in terms of legal documents and proceedings, he's always Edward. If you look at him in the census, in the British census, he's E.A. Crowley. If you look at him in most of his travels and coming and going in U.S. immigration, it's Edward A. Crowley. So what that signifies to me is that there are always sort of two people there. There's Edward Alexander Crowley, who's the person, as under his legal name, and that's always what he's signing papers in. He remains that person for his entire life. But publicly, he assumes a kind of stage name, I would call it. And that's Aleister Crowley, and Aleister Crowley is the fire-breathing, wickedest man in the world. He is the arch-occultist, the satanic figure. But there always, I think there was a separation between those two. Sort of, go ahead.
So do you think that he was kind of, I guess not putting on an act, but kind of performing in a sense?
There is an element of performance in it. And it's, there's an old saying supposedly that if you play a role long enough, the role will begin to play you. And you can see that in the case of people in acting who become clearly identified with a particular role. Typecast, there you go. And you become identified with that role, and then you're never cast as anything else. And the role, the persona sort of becomes you in a respect. And you either fight against that and quit and quit acting, or you just embrace that those are the kind of parts you're going to get and go deeper and deeper into it. So there's a certain element of theatricality in what Crowley is doing. And I'm not really sure where that begins and ends. And when I say that, I don't mean that he's completely I don't think that he is insincere in an Anton LaVey sort of insincerity. I mean, Anton LaVey was sort of doing a put on, was a pantomime of things. I don't think that Crowley goes that, but Crowley had very, I think, complex but deep and firmly held what were essentially religious beliefs. They weren't mainstream religious beliefs, but from his standpoint, I mean, he really saw himself as a kind of Christ figure. That was his whole idea. Following it, his father was a minister of the Christian gospel. And what Crowley did was to become the sort of creator and minister of his own gospel, what's sometimes called Crowleyanity, or what he called Thelema, a religion he comes with supposedly from a channeled book that he was dictated to him one way or the other back in 1904 in Cairo. Where else? The Book of the Law, which is then still the basis of the Thelemic religion, which still exists today, is practiced within the Ordo Templi Orientis, the OTO, an organization that he later became the head of, and which still continues and follows in his beliefs. And there are different branches of that. But I think those were all very real things to him. But I think if you look closely at his works, you don't have to look that closely. I don't think that he was ever clear in terms of exactly what it was that they meant. And there are a couple of cases of all of his works. Probably Magic in Theory and Practice might be the one. If you wanted to sort of get into Crowley, that would be the one to look at. And it comes along later, but it's a much more mature Crowley who's sort of going into this. And he laments to someone at some point, perhaps to himself, that he feels that the gods, or the secret chiefs, as he called them, these super beings in some way, reached out to him at a point. They showed him something. They sort of pulled back the veil and said, look, here it is. This is what you need to pursue. And he spent his life following that direction, but they never did it again. That you're given a glimpse of something, and you try to expand that. You try to, in a sense, pull the curtains wider. You try to solve the mystery, and you don't. And he was disappointed by that. He was also certainly disappointed that his Crowleyanity, that Thelema did not, as he had hoped initially, sweep aside Christianity and usher in a new religious dispensation for the world. That didn't happen, and it still hasn't happened. So that was kind of disappointing. He also once counseled someone in terms of the practice of magic, which is, and this is a very important definition, I think, of all the things maybe that he said, or of his definitions, the most important to me is his definition of magic.
I was actually going to bring this up because I've heard you on another podcast talk about this, and uh, I do like his definition of magic. But go ahead.
Okay. It is, I've said it often enough, I should be able to get it right. So, but to paraphrase it as closely as I can, magic with a K, CK, is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will. So today, whenever you hear someone talking about manifesting something, yeah, that quite a lot. You have to manifest success. You have to any type of thing. If you just sort of get yourself into the right headspace, you can you can project a future that you want. Well, that's roughly what he's talking about. And so that's why I would argue that anybody who talks about manifesting is essentially practicing ritual magic. That's what you're trying to cause change or to shape reality in conformity with what you desire, to bring your desires into reality. Now, Crowley's definition is a little broader because causing change to occur in conformity with will can have a wide array of meanings. It's not just limited to trying to manifest your desires, but that certainly would be a portion of it. And what that boils down to, in a way, in the practical side of it, is it's the bending of reality. And I think that is really a key element when people talk about occultism, and isms are supposedly some kind of belief system, right? If it's an ism, if you're an ist, you've got an ism, and therefore you're. Now, this is why when people try to put ism on the end of something, they're actually promoting it. They're creating something that wasn't there previously because there's arguing that there's somehow some whole system of belief connected to this type of thing. It's not just somebody with a goofy idea. No, it's a whole system of beliefs of goofy ideas. So the occult, to go back to another basic definition, is simply the hidden. And really, it's the belief in a wider hidden world, a world or a wider reality, let's say, that we can't really access through our senses, but which we can access through other means, through other techniques. And the most important of those techniques to access this wider reality is magic. And this is where, in trying to harness the powers of this wider reality, is then to bring into being, to bring into focus, and to create a reality that we want, or to change that in some way. And that's a very interesting and in some ways intriguing, but also slightly frightening idea.
Well, I've also heard you, when you talk about magic, mention the word intent a
Yes,
lot.
everything is about intent. It's Well, this is a simple, in terms of dealing with people. We talked about how difficult it is to know people. And this is what we're trying to always figure out about other people. What do they want? I mean, what's their intention? It doesn't matter what they say or how they act, but what do they mean? I mean, this comes into everything. Something happens. And beyond the thing of simply describing what has happened, the bigger question is, what does it mean? It's I don't know, let's say that you're involved in some sort of terrible accident. I don't know, because it's been in the news a lot. A plane crash, and you're the sole survivor. Well, you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to figure out whether that was just an accident or whether it means something. What does it mean? And the meaning is never absolute. Things don't come with instructions of that kind. The meaning is something that you infer. The meaning is something that can change from one thing to another. So I always want to know what people mean. What's their intent? Do they really like you, or are they just pretending to like you? And most of us never really get that good at it. And oftentimes we're wrong. And I think as time goes on, you simply become more more circumspect about it. And it's I put it this way: I'm way past 30. Okay, that was a long time ago. But looking back, I'd say that probably around the age of 17 was when I felt most like I had things figured out. Okay, it's not the case at all. But at 17, I can remember thinking that, yeah, this all seems to be pretty clear. I think I've got kind of a handle on things. And it's just been a process of continual disillusionment from that point on. Okay, that was the high point of certainty. So I would say that from the perspective now of 73, which is how far I've gotten, that and no, things are a lot less certain. And people are a lot. I mean, people make no more. They make less sense to me now than they did when I was 17 or 30. They have become progressively more mysterious, but that's also because I have more experience with them. And in my take on it is that I think I was on a show not long ago where I said, that most people are polite and helpful and friendly most of the time. I mean, really, most of the people you encounter are okay. It's comparatively rare that you come across someone who is just violently hostile. I mean, you only need no mean know any of those, but that's a fairly rare occurrence.
I beg to differ because I live in New York and go on the subway every day. You see some hostile people.
Yeah, that would be the case. But that was one of the things. I mean, the first time I was ever in New York, having been prepped for this by every television show I'd seen, that's what I expected I was going to walk into, was some sort of like a loony bin, which is going to be a city of. And no, generally speaking, people were okay. Um, wasn't anything particularly weird about them. But while people are generally polite and helpful, or at least not actively hostile most of the time, that can just change in an instant. And usually you don't know why. I think you encounter this type of thing a lot with roommates. At first, see if anybody thinks this sounds familiar. First, the roommate seems okay, but then the longer you live with them, the stranger they get. And until eventually you just can't abide it. I mean, sometimes they're great people, and I've had roommates who were okay. And that's mostly because they weren't around. That was a big advantage because they weren't there most of the time. Other ones, though, it just became increasingly erratic behavior, and I think that's one of the things that complicates. They often say as you get older, it becomes more difficult to make friends. And that's generally true. And part of it is that I think it's just an accumulative that you become increasingly circumspect about that. Friends require a certain amount of commitment, after all. And, did you really want to make that kind of commitment? And, the other idea is that, okay, well, this person seems nice, but I know at some point they're going to prove that they're weird. So, becoming friends with them is just waiting around until the weirdness shows, which is not a good way to look at things. But there's the idea that at 17, you never really think that much about it. Your friends in a very different type of situation that you have later on. And it's so how did we get here from Aleister Crowley? Well, it's the same thing about people looking at Crowley and seeing what they want to see in him. And I never had anything. So let me be perfectly upfront about this. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a practicer of Crowleyanity. I don't really get it. Um, okay, I mean, do what you will shall be the whole of the law. And there's a little bit more to it. Okay, it sounds a little self-indulgent. And, love is the law, love under will. I don't even know exactly what that means. And I think that would it depends upon the particular meaning. And there are complex meanings to terms like love and will. Now, the whole thing in Crowley was that you need to figure out what your true will is and do it. And your true will isn't just some sort of whim that you have. It's kind of your life's mission. You have to figure out really what it is that you're supposed to do in life and focus your attention on that, which I think put in those terms makes more sense than it might otherwise. So I don't think there's anything particularly that spooky about what it is that he does. He believes in a wider universe, unseen forces and intelligences that influence that, and that in some way you can access and harness and utilize these things in your earthly life to expand your awareness and sort of prepare for the next one in some way, which sounds oddly a lot like Christianity. So he isn't that far from where things have gone. But he did actively embrace the kind of bad boy, wicked image, and that stuck with him. But somewhere in the latter part of his life, by the 1930s, he realized how limiting that could be. And there was a case in particular where a woman by the name of Nina Hamnet, who only had a kind of a slight acquaintance with him, wrote a book about her experiences. And she said some, what he argued were libelous things about him. And they were. She was repeating stories. Most of them had to do with about 10 years before this, Crowley had run a kind of occult commune, a sort of spiritual commune in northern Sicily. And it didn't work out very well, like most things that he did. And this woman had gone there with her boyfriend, and her boyfriend had basically gotten sick and died. And she essentially blamed Crowley for this. Now, what Crowley's argument was that the guy drank the water that he told him not to because the water was contaminated, was full of cholera, and he told him not to drink out of that well, and he went ahead and did it anyway. Which is probably that's what the death record says. So she essentially wrote a book in which she repeated various scurrilous or completely false stories about Crowley that maybe a decade before he would have thought would have enhanced his evil image. Well, now he saw a chance to make a comeback and to kind of redeem himself in the public eye. And so he sued her. And it should have been a slam dunk in some way. She couldn't actually back up what she was saying. But what he found once he got into court was that what was on trial, what the defense of this woman presented, was simply his reputation that preceded him. And it was sort of like, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is Aleister Crowley. And they would go through all the things that had been written about him in the paper and all of the inflammatory statements that he had made in or out of context. And it was his reputation that was on trial. And he lost, even though she, in fact, did libel him. But people now were so convinced of the image that they'd had, is that the idea was that, look, this guy is such a rotter to begin with. There's nothing that someone could say and a lie about him that'd be worse than what he's actually done. And the other downside of that case is that it left him a bankrupt, which he was for the rest of his life. He lives until 1947, and he never gets out of bankruptcy. He essentially he basically lives off the charity of British intelligence, who sort of keep him on the shelf for different purposes. But that takes us back to the idea as to where I sort of first really became interested in him and where this intelligence connection came in. Crowley, at different points in time, especially when he was feeling kind of put upon and criticized, would argue that during the First World War, rather than being the traitor that he was accused of being, he had actually been working for His Majesty's government. He was actually a loyal British patriot who had been doing patriotic, if secret sent things in America during the war. Now, here is the problem from his standpoint. The whole of the First World War, from the fall of 1914 until after the war was over, until late 1919, he spent in the United States. So, while everybody else was off fighting in the trenches, doing the rest of it, he was not. He was off in America, having sex, taking drugs, performing magic, as far as they can tell, just loafing around, avoiding the war. So first he looks like, he's dodging the war. You leave the country right after it starts and you don't come back until after it's over. But then the really damning thing was that while in the US, he began writing anti-British propaganda for a pro-German publication called The Fatherland. And he's working with known German agents and propagandists in doing this. Now, he did that. He wasn't just accused of doing it, he did it, and he admitted that he did it. But his argument later was that I was doing this, I was working with German propagandists in the US really to undermine their activities. And one of his arguments in his defense, because look at the stuff that I wrote, and the articles are kind of interesting, and they really are sort of over the top. He goes, look at the stuff I wrote. He goes, who but a German would believe any of that? He had a low opinion of everybody, but then he goes, look, this was just all to convince the Germans that I was on their side, but really, in writing this propaganda, I was lampooning it, and I was writing stuff. And the question was, who was this propaganda supposed to influence? The German public? No. The British public? No. The American public. Neutral America. So one of those little details often forgotten is the United States is a neutral country for most of World War I. We don't come into the war until about the last 18 months, until mid-1917. So prior to that, there really is this kind of propaganda war trying to influence American public opinion either for or against Germany or Britain, but otherwise trying to sort of maneuver the US into the war or keep them out. The Germans wanted to keep us out. The British wanted to bring us in. And they did. It wasn't an act they wanted. And that was part of the plan, which was to bring the United States into the war. So these are the things that Crowley was writing were trying to arguably influence American public opinion, and their ability to in any way sway American public opinion towards Germany, if you actually look at the content of the articles, would be nil. So still, he was writing for a pro-German publication, and he was writing blatantly anti-British articles. But he would later claim that I was doing this. Okay, I was doing it as a kind of secret agent. This was my job. Well, nobody really believed him. I don't even think his friends believed him. So I became kind of interested in that question. And let me be very clear that I didn't have an issue about it one way or the other. I didn't want to, I was just kind of interested to see whether or not in some declassified American intelligence documents from that period, whether there was anything that might substantiate that or refute it. So I knew that, for instance, that during the First World War, there was a thing called the Military Intelligence Division. It was a branch of the US Army. There was no CIA at that time. Really wasn't much of an FBI. And so the MID, military intelligence, was doing most of the counter-subversion and counterintelligence work. And they kept a very voluminous set of files. And those had all been, as intelligence records rarely are, declassified. So you could actually go through and look at the reports that they had on people. So I simply sent off to the National Archives to see whether or not there was a file in the MID records in Aleister Crowley, and lo and behold, there was. It wasn't very long, but contained within that short file was a very critical paragraph. And that paragraph basically said that the MID started investigating him. They were contemplating arresting him. They knew about his prior, the US had entered the war, so he couldn't be a open German propagandist anymore, but they knew what he'd been doing. But they inquired at the British consulate in New York. And the British consulate's reply was, again to paraphrase, we are aware of what he's doing. We're full cognizance of what it is that he's been doing, and he is in the United States on the official business of the British government. So the British had just, that in a sense, confirmed to a degree what he'd said. And it's, Of course, it doesn't say exactly what it is he's doing. Okay, it's one thing to say that he's there with he's doing this stuff with our knowledge, and he's on some sort of official business. And what is that official business? And that essentially is what the book is an effort to find out. If the report had come back and said that he seems to be, if the British consulate had said that we think he's a traitor, well, that would have been that would have been an interesting story in and of itself. But they didn't. And that then began to open up this avenue, and it goes on from there. At the beginning of the next war, World War II, so it's 1939, the war hasn't started yet. But in early 1939, the British government carries out a kind of census. It's called a survey of the British public, at least in England and Wales. It's a census, but one of the things that they're doing is that as they collect data on people, there are notations about prior military experience or connections that people have. What it was all about, I think, is that they knew that there was a war coming. And with the advent of another war coming, it was worthwhile to get an idea as to who out there among the population might be useful in some way. And so there you find an entry for Edward A. Crowley, his legal name. And out in a margin on the side, it has written in blue pencil, emergency list NID. I knew what NID was the initials for. That's a Naval Intelligence Division. That's the same thing that Crowley said he was working for in the last war. NID. And then there's the emergency list. I thought I'd heard of that somewhere. And I look at, well, the emergency list was a list of people, generally former naval officers or employees, who would be available for call-up in the case of an emergency. So it's not like being in the reserves or anything that kind. There's no formal connection. But there was a list of people who, in the event of another war, could be useful and called up, which he was. So lo and behold, when World War II breaks out, Crowley is approached by, guess what? The Naval Intelligence Division, the same people he'd worked for in the last war, and is employed in some sort of vague capacity for most of the war. And that's one of those things that suggests this kind of long-term, it's not a one-off relationship with him. It's something that goes back through the rest of his career, even sort of predating the First World War, I think.
On that, so with secret societies and stuff like that, it always seems that there is a political aspect somewhere rooted in it. So what's your thoughts on that?
In terms of Crowley's politics, or
just in general, just like, there's the Illuminati, there's Bohemian Grove. There's always seems like
there's all of these different groups. Well, I guess one of the things you should ask yourself is why there's so many of them.
Yeah.
I mean, if the Illuminati run everything, then why do you need any other groups? Okay, so why Bilderbergers and the Bohemian Club and supposedly the Illuminati and and a whole array of other groups that you've never heard of? And an example of that, one of the things that eventually made some sort of sense to me out of this was looking at the role of secret societies and politics in interwar France. Okay, now some people may roll their eyes when I mention France, but I think it's true. But it seems to be more obvious there. So interwar France, I'm talking about the 1920s and the 1930s. And one of the things, on the one end, it's bracketed by the First World War, which the French emerged on the winning side, but at a tremendous cost. And then you went through 20 years of chaotic politics. So I would just leave it to anybody who's interested. Look at French politics in the 20s and the 30s, and especially, and it's just governments are coming, you blink and they're gone. Highly unstable. And then you get to 1940, and the thing which has never been entirely clearly explained by anyone, the precipitate collapse of the French war effort in 30 days. So you got to remember the First World War, the French army, to give it credit, fought doggedly for over 4 years and suffered proportionately the highest level of casualties of any combatant country. And yet, in the Second World War, a French army that was large, had modern arms. If you actually look at things like their planes, their tanks in particular, and elsewhere, you find out that they were not second rate to the Germans. French stuff was actually quite good. And yet, psychologically, the country just seems to collapse. And there was at the time in France, and since, always this kind of lurking idea that people had is that there's something weird about that. That there's something going on there that other than just bad generals or bad morale. It's not bad weapons, and it really wasn't bad general. So what had happened? And it's the question that comes up. And so one of the things that I found sort of looking in this sort of chaotic 20 years of French history is that there's just secret societies everywhere. And there are secret societies that attach themselves to the left and others that attach themselves to the right. And some that try to attract scientists and technocrats. And I realized at one point that there were people who moved back and forth between these groups. And in particular, there was a woman by the name of Jeanne Canudo. And someone at some point described her in France as the occult brain, or rather, so as the brain behind most of the occult groups in France in the early 1930s. That wherever you would come across these groups, somehow she was connected to them. And she's not unique in that regard, but it raised, and what I sort of began to realize is that you had these people moving back and forth, sort of seemingly moving across the political spectrum. And what they were doing, it seemed, if maybe I'm imposing some order on this that doesn't exist. But what it seemed to me is that there was a deliberate effort by something that wasn't specifically political to establish influence in every political sphere. So you would form a particular group that would appeal to socialists. You would form another group that would appeal to engineers and technocrats. You would form another group that would appeal to pro-fascists. But above all of this, there was something else that was orchestrating them, and that something else in France has a name, and the name is synarchy. So there's this strange thing called the synarchist movement, and the synarchist movement, its adherents can be found in some way manipulating all of these other groups. And they have an influence in, the money comes from somewhere. So for instance, you find part of the money is coming from banks, but then the other interesting thing is that a lot of the money, especially for these, there was a whole sort of fascist terrorist group called the Cagoule, the hooded ones. And they stored arms, and they sort of had half-baked coups. They were partly, they were serious. They would certainly kill you. But they were a small group that had a lot of money, and their basic goal was to sow discord and uncertainty, to cause trouble. It was never really to take over the government. It was constantly threatened as if they were going to do it. Well, the money for that came from the cosmetics industry. It came from a guy by the name of Eugene Schuller, who ran L'Oreal Cosmetics.
Wow.
Okay. So this cosmetics manufacturer was funneling millions of francs into fascist terrorism. But you had other groups, other businessmen who were funding money into communist groups or into socialist groups. And the goal of this, much as you can tell, was simply to play all of these groups against each other. It was never really to unify anything, but to further divide people. And there's always this element of occultism. There was a group in particular called the Polar Brotherhood, the Polaires. And the Polaires think that they've got a line to the next world because they're communicating with the hidden masters through some kind of super Ouija board. I'm not kidding you. They called it the Oracle, but the description of it is just a very fancy Ouija board. And this included people who are ministers in the French government. So you've got people who are coming to meetings who have an influence in the French government who are now think that they're taking orders from mysterious beings through a Ouija board. That's not actually as weird as you might think, but that's the first place that I came across it. And and then of course you get the France collapses, and you get the collaborationist Vichy regime. And it's actually during the Vichy regime that one of the things you find is that the Vichy regime was very suspicious of secret societies, and particularly of Freemasonry, which they thought was against, which they had some reason to be suspicious. And so they set up this whole sort of government bureau, which was supposed to investigate secret societies and occult groups and figure out what they were going to do. Who was appointed to head that group? Jean Canudo. So literally, the woman who had previously been involved in setting up or influencing many of those groups was now put in charge of a government bureau that was supposed to investigate and suppress them. So what was going on? And this led to the sort of deeper suspicions that the ultimate goal of synarchy was to collapse existing French society so that they could reform it. So first we have to bring the old system down so we can rebuild a new one. And that in some way this synarchic group had been manipulating all of these different groups, had sort of found its way into the left, into the right, whatever part of the political spectrum existed. Synarchy had its agents in influence, and nobody was quite sure how, but there were those that suspected that this all somehow culminated in this astonishing collapse of the French political and military order in 1940. And maybe that's just, again, imposing order on something that isn't there, but it's one of the most stark. Now, the whole thing, where does synarchy come from? Comes from an occultist. All right. So where does that, you go back to the 1890s, and there is a French occultist, a practitioner of ritual magic, a Rosicrucian, and a mystical Freemason by the name of Alexander Saint-Yves d'Alvedra. We'll just call him Dalvedra for short. And I'm sure nobody's ever heard of this guy, but he was quite influential in French occult circles, sort of around the beginning of the 20th century. Now, he, like a lot of people, claimed that he was approached by what else? Mystical figures from the East. They're always from the East. They're never from the North or the South or the West. No, they're always from the East. And this guy who called himself Haji Sharif, and I'm sure he had a turban, and Haji Sharif showed up and he goes, I represent the hidden masters who guide the spiritual destiny of mankind. And you can guess the next part. And you have been chosen to receive this wisdom and knowledge to lead people in the right direction. And under that influence, under the influence of some supposed mystical master from the East, Dalvedra comes up with the idea of synarchy, which was to be a political idea that transcended politics. And the idea is that we'll reorganize, we'll get rid of all those political parties and all the different forms of government, and we'll just reform society. We'll have commerce controlled by one sort of group. Labor will be a separate group. All the artists will have their sphere. So they'll sort of be social constituencies, as opposed to political parties. But then above it all, the mystics, the occultists, will become a new priestly class who will guide the society through their wisdom and through oracles. I don't know, they'll all sit around in a room with a Ouija board and they'll tell us what we're supposed to do. So that's what synarchy, as best as you can describe it, was. And the idea, remember, it's not about politics. It is to eradicate politics and to replace it with this kind of organic occultly guided society that would be the perfect utopia.
It's funny how you say like how most of these people or Crowley or who you're just talking about were approached by these mystic spirits and then or mystic entities, and you would say that most people would be like, oh, that's crazy, but most religions are based off somebody getting spoken to by somebody and them telling them that they're the chosen.
Well,
So
you've got it right there. Okay, somebody goes, I don't know, you're sleeping in a cave. I'm not going to name names. Okay, you're sleeping in a cave, or I don't know, you're treasure hunting in upstate New York. You're doing something, and then all of a sudden, some luminous being, or maybe not luminous, who says they're an angel appears and go, "Ha, okay, you have been chosen for something." And usually that never turns out that well for the human involved in this. Prophets often die bloody deaths, or they don't last that long. But they always just accept this. All right, it's just like I'm an angel. I'm an angel. God has sent me to you. And well, I mean, you're probably frightened, I would assume. So do you say no? But it's just kind of blithely accepted that yeah, this is what it is, and then you go on, and either people think that you're crazy and ignore you, or they don't think that you're crazy, and some of them begin to pay attention, and then more people pay attention, and before you know it, you got a religion on your hands, and they all kind of tend to start that way.
yeah, it's crazy how that works out. The other thing, since we are, I guess, a pop culture podcast, and it feels the influence of the occult and magic and all these things are just all over in pop culture. So, how would you describe the influence of the occult in modern pop culture?
Well, it's all over the place. It's one of the things that I've done. For anybody who's interested, again, shameless promo here. For the Great Courses, which is a company which produces courses in all kinds of things, but anybody can go to the Great Courses. And I've done a course on secret societies. I've done one on crimes of the centuries, and I've done one on the secrets of the occult. So it's a 24-part series where we talk about these things. And the main thing I think I kind of drive into the ground and probably break off in that course is that for anybody who thinks that the occult is something that you only you have to go to some kind of spooky castle. You got to have hooded cultists. No, it's all around you. So let me give you an example of an occult ritual, of a magic ritual that almost everyone has probably engaged in or witnessed at one point in their life. And it's part of our pop, because nothing is more pop culture than sports.
Mhm.
I like sports. And so if you've been to high school, did you ever go to a high school pep rally before a game? The ones where they get everybody into the auditorium. What do you got going on there? Well, first of all, what are you trying to do? Well, you're trying to manifest victory because you got the band playing, everybody is there. You've got, some semblance of dancing virgins. I don't know, but anyway, you get something like you got dancing girls, you got people in animal, you got your animal totems who are hopping around, and you're chanting these things as a group. You're singing songs about how the enemy will be defeated and humbled before you, and how your team will be victorious. You might even then go out and burn the opposing team's mascot in effigy, which was one of the things that was done in high school. They would take the opposing they would take an effigy of the opposing mascot, put it into a coffin, and burn it on a bonfire. Now, this is all done. It's done in the spirit of fun, but this is a ritual. Remember, a ritual is simply a series of actions performed in a particular sequence, in a particular place and time, to affect a a response in the people who are there. And notice that if you go to a pep rally and you're not into what's going on, you'll be criticized for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. You're not cheering. Okay, because you're going to break the mojo if you do that. Remember, everybody's got to get into this, and we must all collectively focus our will to cause what? Change in conformity with will. that we are going to arouse this cone of power over the gymnasium, and that will assure our team victory. Of course, while you're doing this, the opposing team is having its counter ritual. So whose mojo will be the strongest to make the difference? And your team might lose just because you were going to be a Debbie Downer and you were going to sit there and think negative thoughts. You spoiled it for everyone. Now, nobody thinks that a pep rally is an occult ritual, but that's what it's doing. It was the same thing that tribes would do in the Stone Age before they went to war, and it now just continues over and into high school sports.
Funny, I never thought about that because even yeah, like the mascot, it definitely is a totem, and
Yes.
and it's pretty much all these things that you would see in a cult or secret society, but you just wouldn't think to put it that way because it's all in such good fun, I guess you would say.
Yeah, you don't have to go. I mean, look, you don't have to go any further. Everybody's born into a cult, basically.
Mhm.
Okay, if you're an orphan, I don't know, maybe the orphanage is a kind of cult. But what I mean by born into a cult is you're born into a family. And I think, as we all know, families are weird. They're quite idiosyncratic.
Yes.
So, remember, one of the definitions of a secret society put out is that you have to be selected to be a part of it. Not everybody can join. So you're either in the family or you're not. People from the outside are never entirely connected. I mean, I think it varies. One of the things that was always impressed upon me as a kid was the difference between blood relatives and non-blood relatives. Okay, that this is it was sort of like, well, he's your uncle, but he's only your uncle by marriage, which means that he's not really your uncle. He's just we just sort of let them hang out with us. I mean, that's the way we feel about in-laws, isn't it? Really, we just sort of let them. You're not part of this. Not entirely. You will never be absolutely accepted. You cannot convert into the other family, no matter how hard you try. So families have the other thing is that in a secret society, you're sworn to secrecy. It's not the society that's secret, it's what they do. And generally, at some point, you've been told you never air the family's dirty linen public. You don't talk about what goes on in the family to other people outside of it. There is a circle of trust. Okay, you're inside of that. And families have their own little peculiar rituals. And can you remember the first time that you ever maybe saw, I'll just choose Christmas because it's most there, but it can be anything. You go over to somebody else's house and you see how they celebrate the holidays. And it's not the same. It's not exactly the same. They're doing something weird. So I had an experience with that vividly impressed me when I went over and people opened their presents on Christmas Eve. Okay, now that may be perfectly normal for you. This was an abomination. I couldn't, and it was like, wow, the little rituals and things that they do. And so you'll generally experience this mostly if you have in-laws. This is where you can see, you kind of marry into this family, marry into this bunch of weirdos that have these strange customs that you adapt to, but you never quite understand what it is that they're doing. So cults are natural. It's just a natural, and look at the way that cults always build themselves. And even the very successful cults, religions, build themselves this way as well, is that everybody in them are brothers and sisters.
Mhm.
And it's you now become, we're always family. They take the basic cult, the basic human organization, the family, and they try to extend that by creating an artificial family. That's why they're always brothers and sisters. Of course, fraternities and sororities do exactly the same
Mhm.
because they're secret societies and essentially cults.
So I guess groups like Charles Manson and cults like that, it seems like they knew what type of people, I guess, to prey on to and it seems like occult leaders always are comforting people and yeah, bringing that family aspect. You're going to become part of our family. you're you are one of us.
One of us. There we go. Yes, you
And
are one of, and that's what a lot of people want. I mean, we often spend a lot. We want to become one of something. It's now this comes back. As I said earlier, that I'm not a follower of Aleister Crowley. I don't have anything against him, but it's not my. That's not the reason I'm interested in him. I'd also point the fact that I am not now, nor have ever been, the member of any kind of fraternal order or secret society or cult that I'm aware of, other than my family. Um, and here's the reason why it doesn't appeal to me, because it's always somebody telling you what to do. I mean, okay, it's all, oh, you're our brother and our sister, you're gonna come. But as soon as you get into it, first of all, there's somebody at the center of this thing who you're supposed to revere as if they're a deity. You can do no wrong. And you're supposed to do whatever it is they say. And then there will be all of these kind of rules. Well, brother, you can do this, but you can't do this now. I can do the rest of it. And I don't like that. The one thing that I've tried to spend my life avoiding as much as possible is any situation where people have power over me and can tell me what to do. The IRS still has that power, but nevertheless, never found a way to go to. But to avoid that as much as possible. I mean, the Cub Scouts were too much for me, to be perfectly honest. Even that was just too regimented, too many knots to tie, and there was always someone telling you what to do. So I don't get the whole. This is the reason why I'm interested in studying these things, because it's like trying to figure out what the mystery is. I don't get it. I don't get why you want to sublimate your entire being in some sort of organization that will regiment your life.
I feel the same way, but my fascination is more with the leader, how they intrigue people to like how like it fascinates me how one person can get a bunch of people to follow them.
I don't, because often you look at them and they just appear. It's like, why this guy? Okay, to me he looks like a schlub. Okay, I don't. And he's just sitting there spouting. Yeah, I don't want to characterize them all, but that's often what it seems like. So, an early encounter I had with this when I was in college. I was in grad school in in Santa Barbara, California, and it's California, so there were cults a go everywhere. But there was one group that was sort of growing, and it was it's another one of these mishmash rip-offs of theosophy. I think there were more ascended masters from the east who were involved. There were also Lemurians and possibly aliens. So some guy who basically, as far as I can tell, started out as a yoga teacher, began to get more into metaphysics and started having meetings in his trailer. And then that expanded to other groups, and people began to pay attention to what he said and hang on his every word. And he may have been quite sincere about some of this, but it eventually evolved into what became a full-blown cult and business empire. And so there were businesses, there were whole food markets that were run. They had farms where the food was grown. They had sort of health food restaurants that went along with this. And that's, of course, where the members of the cult worked for basically nothing, because this was part of their religious duty. And then, the other things went along. They started, what are you going to have? Okay, we're going to have a compound up in the mountains. What's the next thing? Oh, storing arms. Okay, because it always comes up, there's going to be an apocalypse, and we'll have to have weapons to fend off the zombies when that happens. So you get into, bunkers and weapons stores, and then you find out people are basically being chained up to work in kitchens, and people can't leave. But I first ran into this when there was a couple that I knew. They weren't friends, but they were people, sort of friends of friends, who were just ecstatic. They were in the full, for full bloom of conversion, and they were just talking about how wonderful this guy was and the rest of it. And I actually saw him talk once. They got me to go to one of their meetings, and I was unimpressed. I was unimpressed with the guy. I was unimpressed with what he was saying. That just could be because I'm an idiot, but nevertheless, it's my idiocy. That's my reality. And I couldn't see what they were getting so And then I find out that part of what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to hand over all of the, see, material possessions are bad. So, but they're somehow good if you give them to the church. Catholic Church figured this out a long time ago. That's bad. But if you give it to us, it's a ticket to heaven. So his whole idea was that one of the people involved in this had a trust fund. So they were going to turn over their trust fund. They were going to sell their car. They were going to liquidate their assets and give it all to him. And one of the things that he apparently did with much of this money is that he bought a yacht for his headquarters. So this guy's living on a yacht. And they've now handed over all of their material possessions. Now, let me point out that these people were college graduates. I think both of them held degrees in something. They're not stupid in a normal sense. And I couldn't fathom this. And the only thing that I could think of to say to them, and I can remember thinking, is like, have you lost your mind? I mean, what? Are you nuts? Because why would you do that? And I've there's like, oh, well, this, it's the wisdom and it's the knowledge and we're getting and we're leading much better. And I guess it worked for them for a while. This whole thing fell apart later in years and scandal, arrests. It went the general
Like
sort
most
of
of them do.
yes, it all went to hell in a handcart. But I couldn't comprehend how people who seem to be otherwise rational human beings would willingly put themselves into that position. And it's one of the things that I think that makes the study of something like, why secret societies or cults are not just things that they can sometimes be tremendously influential. And it comes back to the idea of something like synarchy, as vague as it was, actually being able to influence the ideas of French politicians. And by the way, something like this isn't just limited to France. Other countries had the same sort of thing which was going on. In fact, step back into that a moment. To me, one of the eeriest things that came in, and it was a discussion that was occurring in France in the 30s, is that, well, the argument was that synarchy will be for France what fascism is for Italy, what Bolshevism is in Russia, and what National Socialism is in Germany. Those are all just, and the idea that true or not creates is that all of these apparently different and even antagonistic ideologies are sort of crafted to fit particular places and circumstances. And that what even the participants in them don't realize is that it's all part and parcel of the same thing. It's just a different flavor.
Yeah, so I have this discussion. I had this discussion with my friend about all our basic religions. Uh, you can be Muslim, you can be Jewish, you can be Catholic, Christian. It's just all different flavors, but it all leads back to the same thing at the end of the day.
Well, it's an interesting, if you take, you know, Christians, Muslims, and Jews, the one thing you can get them to agree upon, maybe, is that they all revere the same God. Same God. So what's the difference? I mean, how far can you be from each other if you all revere the same God and all sort of believe basically the same things about that God? So that's not really what it appears to me that they're fighting over. I know I'm going way off into the
No,
weeds
no,
of
no.
theology at this point, but nevertheless, you're not fighting over different gods. You all worship the same God. You're fighting over which sort of prophet dispensation it comes from. So you're actually fighting over men. You're not fighting over God, which I'm not sure God would approve. I don't know what it was. How does that work? But and it's one of the things that human beings are quite good at is finding the differences between things. That it's easier, arguably, to define yourself by what you're not than by what you are. Similar to someone once said is the idea that when you're really hungry, Now, sometimes it's difficult to figure out what it is you want to eat. You reach that point where you know that you're hungry, but everything somebody suggests, it doesn't sound good. You want something that isn't part of the array of foods that you have. So in many ways, we tend to define ourselves. We find something to define ourselves against. I am not this. I don't know exactly what I am, but I'm not that. So you then have a whole set of characteristics, features, things that you make up about this group or whatever it is, but I'm not those things. And it has to be this kind of negative definition. So it's almost as if that rather than looking for sort of common points, we prefer to find sort of differing points so that we can differentiate ourselves for something.
Yeah, and then that's what it seems that what all these religions tend to be, just people trying to make their little difference about their religion. What again, where I see it, it all kind of just comes back to the same thing.
Well, it's and there were, and you can find this, if you're looking at something like Protestantism. I mean, what it started as a rebellion against the Catholic Church. Catholic Church bad. Okay, so we'll reform it, but they could never agree upon how to do that, and then there was this endless series of arguments. Okay, we're not going to be Catholics, but then I don't know, is there predestination or is there not predestination or this or that? And this you end up with 100 different sects of what was never a unified movement in that case. So in that kind of situation, it brings us back to this idea as to why things like cults can thrive is because they help people define themselves. So join our group, and this is what you become. You're now our brothers and our sisters, and we're apart from everyone else. This is what Manson sold to his father. It's us against the world. There's going to be an apocalyptic race war, and we'll go out into the desert and hide in a hole. And when it's over with, we'll be the only ones left. We are the chosen.
So another thing I wanted to get into was it seems like in the 60s and 70s there was like a lot of rock bands and even now a lot of music that embraces occult imagery and talks about it. Why was that so big in the 60s and 70s?
Uh, I think part of it was what we call the counterculture, which was trying to define itself against what was thought to be particularly staid and boring post-war American culture. I mean, a lot of that gets into social history. After World War II, which was a big deal, and which everybody was involved in some degree or another, the great desire was for people just to get back to normalcy. Or to create some semblance of normalcy, because you weren't getting back to normalcy because before World War II was the Depression, right? And before the Depression, it was the 20s and Prohibition. You'd go, so there's never any normal. But the idea was that, people wanted to come back, get married, establish families because they had grown up in unstable, chaotic times. And people who fought in World War II had generally grown up in the Depression, and so the idea for normality, stability was something they had. On the other hand, for people born in that environment, like me, it was perceived as being staid and boring. It was uncool. It was what your parents did, and there were all kinds of things that were very restrictive about it in some sense. And so in the 60s, you developed mostly this kind of generational rebellion by ungrateful children like myself. But, and there were reasons for it, but I can look back and then I go, it's just what a bunch of ingrates. But nevertheless, still, it was fun. And the drugs were bad. But anyway, so whatever it was that your parents didn't want you to do, or that straight society frowned on, was something that youth, if you were looking to rebel, you would and define yourself against. And if you look at something like the hippie movement, it was all to kind of create this particular identity, to an identity which separated you from other people around you, particularly your parents or anyone of that or generations before them. And so anything that was kind of outside the norm was attractive, and it was it was the kind of Luciferian appeal. So you got arguably, and this within the history of occultism figures in, you've got sort of two currents that run through human cultures. And one of them is the current, often represented by religion, or the established religion, that has the thou shalt and thou shalt not. There are things, mostly things that you can't do. You're forbidden to do these things. Okay? Judaism in particular has hundreds of laws, regulations about all kinds of things. They may not apparently make any sense, but you nevertheless are obliged to do them. And the kind of restrictions that are so much of it is based upon the rules that you have to follow. But then there's another one, which is sometimes used the very long word antinomianism. And antinomianism is the rule that says, no, defy all those laws. I mean, don't just ignore those laws, break them. Freedom is in breaking free of those restrictions. And while usually the side of law and order wins out because they've got law and order on their side, there's always this current, which is always resisting that. It's always there just beneath the surface. And in fact, you can take this story back. Let's just take it back to where it begins. Take it back to the story of Genesis. Adam and Eve in the garden, they're given rules. And those most important of those rules is that there are these two trees here. All right. See, all the rest of the stuff you can have, but you don't eat from those. That is forbidden. And then, the serpent, good guy, bad guy, what is it? Comes along and goes, no, this is to keep you enslaved and ignorant. This is to, you're just going to be glorified pets in a terrarium. So what you have to do is, first of all, eat of the tree of knowledge and wise up. And then eventually, the tree of life, which will grant you immortality. And just read that whole story. Go back and see it. And then you've got God or gods, or I don't know who's having to get. It's a we. It's the Elohim. They go, oh, well, they've eaten of the tree of knowledge. They've learned too much. We've got to stop them before they eat of the tree of life and become like us. So the whole sort of antinomian view of Eden is that the serpent, whoever the serpent represents, is the hero of the story. He is the Prometheus figure. He was helping Adam and Eve. Now, true, it caused a lot of trouble, but that the only way that they escaped being glorified guinea pigs in a terrarium, ignorant of everything around them, was by following his example. And so this arguably has always been this kind of war between authority and what could be called the Luciferian principle of rebellion. I mean, that goes back, the whole idea of Satan rebels against God. Who put him in charge? I mean, that's okay. I don't know. I think I could run this place better. Okay. And he gets a third of the angels. Okay, this is a legend, it's a story, but the story itself illustrates something. Remember, all of these stories come out of the human mind. They come out of the human imagination. And this was the way that we conceived of it, a rebellion against heaven itself to replace it with a kind of new order. And then later on, centuries later, in places like France, you get societies dedicated to what? Collapsing everything that exists so we can rebuild something new. In the 18th century in Bavaria, you've got Adam Weishaupt, the guy, the university professor of law who founds the Illuminati, the real Illuminati. And what is its goal? To undermine and destroy all existing governments and religions to replace it with a new enlightened order. Storm heaven, bring it down, replace God. So this is this whole thing which plays out. It's the same thing which is at work, and if you look closely, you'll see it in all of these things.
So pretty much what you're saying is, I guess, basically music. They're just looking for a way to rebel against.
Well, part of it was the music was good. It was part of it. Okay, it was different. I mean, it was a matter of the time. I mean, my mom and dad liked Perry Como. Okay, if you were really more in the Jefferson Airplane, it was a generational thing you would have to have. Yeah, the parents didn't generally get into it because it wasn't their music. It wasn't the type of thing they're used to. And the same way, I mean, there's a certain thing when you get older when pop culture just becomes alien. So it's a so I'll make a confession. I'm like the antithesis for the Swiftie. I know who Taylor Swift is. I cannot tell you the name of a single song that
Oh,
she has
don't
ever
worry,
put.
neither can
I
I.
don't, and I don't care.
Same.
It simply doesn't. They're all just sort of like some new sort of Disney clone girl singer. This kind of. At some point, you just quit paying attention to you, and it just becomes alien. So, you ultimately you will become the fuddy duddies that you rebelled against early on. But I think that the appeal of the occult and the appeal of someone like, the whole thing is that on the cover of Sergeant Pepper's, Aleister Crowley, the Beatles put Aleister Crowley. Well, they put lots of people's pictures on there. So I would always remind people, don't just look at Crowley. Look at who, and the whole thing is people we like. And one of the appeals that Crowley had was that Crowley appeared to be a villainized, marginalized, misunderstood figure who's claimed to be some kind of prophet and made a lot of fuddy-duddy people apparently angry. That's what they were interested in. That's why he was there. I mean, they liked the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi too for a while.
Mhm.
So there's a whole collection of it. But the occult there's never any period where it's out of style. It's always there. There's always that appeal to these things that it has because it's the alternative. Um, you know, you get disabused of going to church and worshiping God. Well, there's always Satan. I mean, though that offer is always sort of there. Even though that's just aren't you just doing the same thing? I don't know. And giving it a different name, but at least it seems different.
Well, it
And
seems
yet,
like I mean they have their own. I guess they don't call them commandments. They call them their seven tenets, but it's kind of the same thing. They have their own list of rules, and
they have to keep order. It can't just be a free for all. I mean, a black mass has to have a certain order to it. You just don't go in and do everything that you would want to. So that's the other thing you find. Wherever you go in this area where you think that it's going to be free and you can do whatever you want, no, it never works. Change one set of rules for another set of rules, one authority for another authority. Still there?
yeah, 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 yeah.
Oh, okay.
You just froze up for a second, but everything
Okay.
is
Well,
there.
so did you. So,
But
or you were very still. I couldn't really tell which. But okay.
but so I'm guessing the only way to really not have rules is to be the cult leader yourself.
Yes, but
And
even that can be. Well, I don't know whether you ever saw a documentary. I think it's called Wild Wild Country, and
oh,
it's about
great documentary. Yeah.
yes, it's about the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh Osho and the whole little that place that I don't live that far from. Um, but the thing you got to watch out for if you're the cult leader is your second in command, right? Because the person who often you assign, well, you're channeling thoughts from the ascended masters. There's someone else who's actually running your organization, and that's the one who will take over. They're the ones who will decide we're going to poison a salad bar in this town in order to sway the county elections.
Yeah, yeah, Wild Wild Country. I remember watching that during COVID, and I was just again just amazed how somebody can just start just by preaching to people and then making a whole town and getting all these people to give up all their personal effects. It just blows my mind how somebody can do that.
They all start dressing in the same color. That's good. Are we all wearing the same color clothes?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah, it
that
was
might be
orange.
important.
Yeah.
So if you have, am I in a cult? Is everyone in orange?
Mhm.
Um, and then the other thing he did was if he didn't he just stop talking? Okay, he's
Yeah.
like, I've said everything I'm going to say, so now I'll just be silent. And people would come in and watch him be silent.
Well, and
Uh,
it's also crazy how you said people don't notice. You gave up all your money, but then this guy has two mansions and Three cars.
And there's the machine guns. Okay, there's always the weapons. And yeah, but it was his number two, Sheila, who
Yep.
was running. She she was the mastermind of the whole thing.
Well, I could probably keep you on here for another hour or so just listening to you talk.
Well, I do have to get to a dinner
No,
engagement
no,
at
no,
some
no.
point soon. So, but
But we
yeah,
are gonna, that's where I am
yeah,
getting, but we are gonna cut this here. I do appreciate your time. This was very fun. Hopefully, maybe you can come on again another time and
yeah, sure.
delve into some more subjects that we didn't get into. And yeah, I hope everybody listening enjoys this. I will put all the links to the stuff that he talked about, uh, his books, and the links to everything down there. So if you guys want to
Oh, let me plug one more thing,
plug
since
it,
I don't have to plug things. I have, with a friend of mine, started. Well, what did we decide to do? We decided we were going to start a podcast, and it's on a variety of subjects. Everything from Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley is in there. Some bizarre political murders in the 1920s. It's called Strange as It Seems. And it can be most easily found on YouTube. Where else? You'll need to do "Strange as It Seems" Spence to make it come up.
gotcha.
The whole thing is that we kind of desperately want people to actually look at this. So if you're interested, take a look. We have 6 episodes up, and there's some more to come.
You definitely got a follower here because I would definitely be
Well,
watching
thank you.
that. And yeah, we will have the links to all that below, everybody. So please go follow, watch the podcast. If you have a chance to pick up any of his books, we'll leave the links for that as well. And thank you again, everybody. And as always, may the force be with you.
Bye bye.